September 15, 1943. Above the rolling wheat fields of occupied Ukraine, at an altitude of 3,000 feet, German dive bomber pilot Hauptmann Klaus Weber adjusted his Junkers Ju-87 Stuka for another precision strike against a Soviet supply depot. The morning sun glinted off his cockpit as he prepared to execute what military doctrine promised would be a routine operation against defenseless agricultural targets. Weber had completed over 200 successful bombing runs across the Eastern Front, and this sleepy farming district seemed no different from countless others he had leveled with methodical efficiency. Little did he know that his aircraft, capable of carrying a 1,800-pound bomb load and diving at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, was about to be challenged by a weapon that had remained unchanged since the time of David and Goliath. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded in the skies above that Ukrainian village would challenge every assumption about modern warfare and prove that sometimes the most ancient technologies, combined with extraordinary skill and desperate courage, could triumph over the most advanced military engineering of the 20th century. Far below, 18-year-old Anya Petrivna Kovalenko crouched among the golden stalks of her family's wheat field, clutching a leather sling her grandfather had crafted for her 7th birthday. The weapon measured exactly 3 feet in length, with a pouch woven from strips of cured deerskin that could cradle stones weighing up to 4 ounces. Anya had spent 11 years perfecting her technique, initially using the sling to protect her family's crops from ravens and wild boar, gradually developing an accuracy that local villagers whispered bordered on supernatural. She could strike a sparrow in flight at 100 yards, or place a stone through a window the size of a dinner plate at twice that distance. The German bombing campaign had been intensifying for weeks. Soviet intelligence reports indicated that the Luftwaffe was conducting systematic strikes against agricultural infrastructure to weaken civilian morale and disrupt food supplies to the Red Army. The local garrison had been withdrawn 2 days earlier, leaving the farming communities completely defenseless against air attack. Conventional anti-aircraft weapons were non-existent in this rural sector, and the nearest Soviet fighter squadron was stationed over 400 miles away. Anya's family had been forced to evacuate their farmhouse 3 times in the past month as German dive bombers systematically targeted barns, grain silos, and livestock pens throughout the region. Her father, Petro Kovalenko, had served as a machine gunner in the Imperial Russian Army during the First World War and understood the devastating psychological impact of aerial bombardment on civilian populations. When they control the sky, he had told his daughter, they control everything beneath it. But even eagles can be brought down by a well-placed stone. The approaching Stuka's distinctive gull-wing silhouette became clearly visible as Weber began his attack dive. The aircraft's Junkers Ju-211 engine produced a characteristic whistling sound that had earned it the nickname Jericho trumpet among German pilots. Designed specifically to terrorize ground targets during the final moments before impact, the Stuka carried 2 500-pound bombs beneath its wings and a single 1,000-pound bomb beneath its fuselage, enough explosive power to obliterate an entire city block. Weber had selected his target with typical German precision, the village's grain storage facility, which intelligence reports suggested contained enough wheat to feed 3 Soviet rifle battalions for an entire winter. His mission briefing had indicated 0 defensive capabilities in the target zone, with the nearest known anti-aircraft installation located over 60 miles to the southeast. The pilot had every reason to expect another routine mission with minimal risk. As the Stuka entered its steep attack dive, Anya made a calculation that would have impressed mathematicians at any university in Europe. She estimated the aircraft's speed, angle of descent, and probable flight path, then selected a smooth riverstone weighing approximately 3½ ounces from her leather ammunition pouch. The stone had been polished by decades of water erosion into an almost perfect sphere, dense enough to maintain velocity over long distances, yet small enough to achieve maximum acceleration from her sling. What happened next violated every principle of modern aerial warfare. Anya began the ancient rhythm of the sling, spinning the weapon in wide circles above her head, while tracking the diving aircraft through peripheral vision. The technique required extraordinary timing and spatial awareness, as she needed to release the stone at precisely the moment when the aircraft's trajectory would intersect with the projectile's ballistic path. Soviet military engineers would later calculate that Anya's stone achieved an initial velocity of approximately 180 feet per second, reaching an altitude of nearly 800 feet before beginning its descent toward the diving Stuka. The timing of her release demonstrated an intuitive understanding of physics that would have impressed artillery officers trained at the finest military academies. Weber first noticed something unusual when his aircraft shuddered slightly during what should have been a smooth dive. German engineering had produced the Stuka as one of the most stable diving platforms in aviation history, and experienced pilots could typically complete their bombing runs with minimal turbulence. The slight vibration seemed inconsistent with normal flight characteristics, but Weber initially attributed it to minor air currents common at low altitude. The 3.5-ounce river stone struck the Stuka's starboard wing root at an angle of approximately 45 degrees, traveling at a combined impact velocity of over 500 feet per second, when calculated against the aircraft's diving speed. While the stone's mass was insignificant compared to the aircraft's total weight of 9,000 pounds, its impact occurred at precisely the most vulnerable point in the Stuka's structural design. The wing root housed critical control cables connecting the pilot's stick to the aircraft's aileron control surfaces. German engineers had concentrated these cables in a relatively small space to maximize aerodynamic efficiency, but this design choice created a single point of failure that could compromise the entire aircraft's controllability. The stone's impact severed 3 of the 4 primary aileron control cables and damaged the wing's main structural spar. Weber immediately realized his aircraft was in serious trouble. The Stuka began rolling uncontrollably to the right, and his attempts to level the wings using normal control inputs produced no response. German pilot training included extensive practice in emergency procedures, but the scenario of simultaneous control cable failure and structural damage was considered so unlikely that specific protocols had never been developed. "Something has struck the aircraft," Weber reported over his radio to squadron leader Major Ernst Hoffmann, circling at 5,000 feet above the target zone. "Aileron control is completely lost, attempting to abort bombing run and return to base, using rudder control only." Hoffmann scanned the sky for enemy aircraft, but found only empty blue horizon. Soviet fighter activity had been minimal in this sector for over 2 weeks, and radar stations had detected no hostile aircraft within 100 miles of their current position. The idea that ground-based anti-aircraft fire could have damaged Weber's aircraft seemed equally unlikely, given intelligence reports indicating 0 defensive installations in the target area. Weber's Stuka continued its uncontrolled descent, but the pilot's 15 years of flying experience enabled him to maintain some directional control using rudder inputs and engine throttle adjustments. He jettisoned his bomb load over an empty field to reduce weight and improve his chances of executing an emergency landing. The 3 bombs created massive craters in the farmland, but caused no casualties among the local population. Anya watched the aircraft's erratic flight path with a mixture of amazement and terror. She had expected her stone to perhaps frighten the pilot or cause minor damage, but the sight of a German bomber spiraling out of control exceeded her most optimistic expectations. The girl remained hidden among the wheat stalks, uncertain whether the aircraft might still pose a threat to her village. Weber managed to bring his damaged Stuka down in a relatively controlled crash landing in an abandoned pasture, approximately 2 miles from his original target. The aircraft's landing gear collapsed upon impact, and the starboard wing suffered additional structural damage, but the pilot emerged without serious injury. He immediately began destroying sensitive navigation equipment and radio codes to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Major Hoffmann directed 2 additional Stukas to circle the crash site, while radioing for a rescue helicopter from the nearest German airfield. The entire squadron had been scrambled to investigate what appeared to be a completely unprecedented incident. Luftwaffe doctrine included detailed analyses of aircraft losses from enemy fighter attack, anti-aircraft fire, and mechanical failure, but none of these categories seemed to explain Weber's situation. Within minutes of the crash landing, curious villagers began emerging from their hiding places to examine the downed aircraft. Weber found himself surrounded by approximately 30 Ukrainian farmers, including several elderly men who had served in various armies during the First World War. To his surprise, the villagers showed no hostility toward the German pilot, instead offering water and basic medical attention. Anya approached the crash site with considerable caution, still carrying her grandfather's sling. She had never seen a German aircraft up close and was amazed by the complexity of its engineering. The Stuka's cockpit contained dozens of gauges, switches, and control mechanisms that seemed impossibly sophisticated compared to the simple farming tools that dominated her daily experience. Weber examined his aircraft's damage with growing bewilderment. The severed control cables showed clean breaks consistent with high-velocity impact, but he could find no evidence of shrapnel, bullet holes, or explosive damage that would indicate conventional anti-aircraft fire. The damage pattern suggested something had struck his wing with tremendous force, but the nature of the projectile remained completely mysterious. "What happened to your airplane?" asked Dmitry Kovalenko, Anya's 16-year-old brother, in broken German learned during the occupation. Weber shook his head in frustration. "I do not know. Something hit the wing during my attack dive, but I saw no other aircraft and no ground fire. It is impossible to explain." Anya stepped forward and, with remarkable courage for someone her age, held up the leather sling for Weber to examine. "I threw a stone at your airplane," she said in careful German, her voice trembling with nervousness. Weber stared at the girl and her primitive weapon with complete incomprehension. The concept that a teenager armed with a Stone Age implement had successfully engaged and damaged a modern military aircraft seemed to violate the fundamental logic of 20th century warfare. He examined the sling with professional curiosity, noting its craftsmanship and the smooth stones in Anya's ammunition pouch. "You are joking," Weber said, but his tone suggested growing uncertainty rather than dismissive skepticism. Anya demonstrated her technique by selecting a stone and launching it toward a fence post approximately 100 yards away. The projectile struck its target dead center, with an audible crack that drew impressed murmurs from the assembled villagers. Weber watched with growing amazement as the girl repeated her demonstration twice more, each shot finding its mark with precision that matched his own bombing accuracy. Major Hoffmann's rescue helicopter arrived 30 minutes later, and Weber faced the impossible task of explaining his aircraft's loss to his commanding officer. Luftwaffe protocol required detailed incident reports for all aircraft damage, but no standardized form existed for attacked by peasant girl with Slingshot. Weber's initial radio communication described his situation as mechanical failure during attack dive, knowing that any mention of ground-based stone throwing would result in questions about his mental fitness for duty. The helicopter crew examined the damaged Stuka and confirmed Weber's assessment that something had struck the wing with considerable force. The clean breaks in the control cables suggested high-velocity impact, but the complete absence of typical anti-aircraft damage markers left German technical experts without any reasonable explanation for the incident. Soviet intelligence operatives learned about the incident within hours through their network of civilian informants throughout occupied Ukraine. Initial reports seemed so improbable that senior officers demanded multiple confirmations before accepting that a farm girl armed with a traditional sling had successfully engaged a German dive bomber. The story reached Moscow within 2 days, where it was immediately classified as a state secret to prevent German forces from learning about Soviet defensive capabilities. Captain Ivan Petrov, a Red Army intelligence specialist with extensive experience analyzing Luftwaffe tactics, interviewed Anya 3 days after the incident. Petrov had studied German air operations for over 2 years and understood that dive bomber pilots represented some of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aviators. The idea that such a pilot could be defeated by primitive weapons seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about modern military technology. "Show me exactly what you did," Petrov instructed, bringing his own technical equipment to measure and document Anya's technique. Anya repeated her demonstration, using the same type of river stone she had selected for the actual engagement. Petrov's calculations indicated that her projectile achieved muzzle velocity, comparable to some small-caliber firearms, with accuracy that surpassed many Soviet infantrymen armed with conventional weapons. The girl's 11 years of practice had developed muscle memory and spatial judgment that military training academies typically required months to instill in their students. Petrov's report to Moscow emphasized the psychological rather than tactical significance of the incident. While slingshots would never become practical anti-aircraft weapons, the story of Anya's success provided powerful propaganda material for Soviet efforts to maintain civilian morale under occupation. The report concluded that even our youngest civilians possess the courage and skill necessary to challenge German technological superiority. Weber's return to his squadron marked the beginning of a personal crisis that would define the remainder of his military service. The German pilot found himself unable to explain his aircraft's loss, without seeming either incompetent or psychologically unstable. His commanding officers accepted his mechanical failure explanation, but privately questioned whether combat stress might be affecting his judgment and performance. The incident report filed by Weber's squadron described the aircraft loss as structural failure during attack dive, cause unknown. German engineering teams examined the wreckage after Soviet forces withdrew from the area 6 weeks later, but their technical analysis proved inconclusive. The damage pattern remained inconsistent with any known anti-aircraft weapon, and German intelligence had no record of advanced Soviet defensive systems in that particular sector. Weber began experiencing recurring nightmares about teenage girls armed with primitive weapons challenging the technological superiority of German military forces. The psychological impact of his defeat proved more devastating than any physical injury he might have sustained in the crash. During his remaining 18 months of combat service, Weber's bombing accuracy declined significantly, and he frequently aborted attack runs when he spotted civilians in target areas. Anya's village became something of a pilgrimage site for Soviet civilians throughout occupied Ukraine. Word of her achievement spread through informal networks, despite German efforts to suppress any discussion of their military setbacks. Farmers throughout the region began crafting slings and practicing stone throwing, though none achieved Anya's extraordinary skill level. The psychological warfare implications of the incident extended far beyond its immediate tactical impact. German pilots operating in occupied territories began reporting increased nervousness during low-altitude attack runs, particularly when targeting agricultural areas where civilian populations might be present. Luftwaffe commanders noticed a measurable decline in dive bombing accuracy throughout the entire Eastern Front during the final months of 1943. Soviet military historians would later analyze the incident as an example of how individual courage and traditional skills could challenge technological superiority under specific circumstances. The study emphasized that Anya's success resulted from unique combinations of personal ability, favorable conditions, and extraordinary luck that could never be replicated as standard military doctrine. Weber survived the remainder of World War II, but never forgot his encounter with the Ukrainian farm girl and her ancient weapon. After Germany's surrender in 1945, he returned to civilian life as a commercial pilot, but frequently told his story to fellow aviators. Most listeners assumed Weber was describing a fictional event designed to illustrate the unpredictable nature of combat aviation. Anya completed her education after the war and eventually became a mathematics teacher at the same village school she had attended as a child. She rarely discussed her wartime experience, but occasionally demonstrated traditional sling techniques for her students during lessons about ancient history and primitive technologies. Her classroom contained a display case with her grandfather's leather sling and several of the river stones she had collected for ammunition during the occupation. In 1968, 25 years after their first encounter, Weber made a personal pilgrimage to Anya's village during a vacation trip through Soviet Ukraine. He located her at the village school and introduced himself as the German pilot she had engaged during the war. Anya remembered the incident clearly and welcomed Weber with traditional Ukrainian hospitality. "I never intended to hurt you personally," Anya explained through a translator during their emotional reunion. "I was only trying to protect my family and our village from the bombing. You seemed like a good man who was following orders, not an evil person." Weber expressed profound gratitude for Anya's restraint and compassion during their original encounter. "You could have encouraged the other villagers to capture or harm me after my aircraft was down," he acknowledged. "Instead, you showed kindness to an enemy pilot who had come to destroy your home. That taught me more about humanity than all my military training." Their meeting lasted several hours, during which Anya demonstrated her sling technique for Weber's benefit. The former Luftwaffe pilot watched with the same amazement he had felt 25 years earlier, finally achieving complete understanding of how his sophisticated military aircraft had been defeated by such a primitive weapon. He presented Anya with a photograph of himself standing beside his reconstructed Stuka at a German aviation museum, signed with the inscription, "To the bravest warrior I ever faced in combat." The story of Anya's achievement eventually became part of Soviet military folklore, though official records remained classified until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Military academies throughout Eastern Europe began including discussions of the incident in courses about unconventional warfare and civilian resistance techniques. Modern military historians studying the incident have noted its significance as one of the few documented cases in which Stone Age technology successfully engaged 20th-century military aircraft. The event illustrated how traditional skills, when combined with exceptional ability and favorable circumstances, could still play meaningful roles in mechanized warfare. Weber's experience fundamentally changed his perspective on the relationship between technology and human capability. His post-war writings emphasized that sophisticated military equipment could not replace individual skill, courage, and determination. "The most advanced aircraft," he wrote in his autobiography, "is still controlled by a human being who can make mistakes, and it can still be challenged by other human beings who possess extraordinary abilities." Anya lived until 1997, spending her final years as a respected member of her community and a living symbol of civilian resistance during wartime. Her obituary in the local newspaper described her as a teacher who proved that ancient wisdom and modern courage could overcome any challenge. The village erected a small monument near the site where her stone had struck Weber's aircraft, featuring a bronze sculpture of a young girl holding a traditional sling. The leather sling crafted by Anya's grandfather is now displayed at the Ukrainian National Museum of Military History in Kiev, where it represents the contribution of civilian populations to their nation's defense during World War II. Museum visitors often express amazement that such a simple weapon could have engaged modern military aircraft, but historical documentation confirms every detail of Anya's extraordinary achievement. Military technology analysts have used the incident to illustrate the importance of protecting aircraft from unexpected threats during low-altitude operations. Modern combat aircraft include defensive systems designed to detect and counter various forms of ground-based attack, but these systems remain vulnerable to unconventional weapons that fall outside normal threat parameters. The story continues to inspire discussions about the role of individual initiative in warfare and the potential for traditional skills to remain relevant in technological conflicts. Military academies worldwide include Anya's achievement in case studies about asymmetric warfare and unconventional tactics, emphasizing that human creativity and determination can overcome apparent technological disadvantages. Weber's final letter to Anya, written shortly before his death in 1989, expressed his lifelong gratitude for their encounter and its impact on his understanding of warfare and humanity. "You taught me," he wrote, "that true victory comes not from superior weapons, but from superior character. Your courage and compassion transformed an enemy into a friend, and that is the greatest military achievement possible." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.